All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's filtered webinar. It's Make the Most of Pivot Tables. Thanks to you all for joining us. I know it must have been hard to get back into sort of a working mood after the England-Wales game. Hope you enjoyed that as well, everyone, regardless of what side you're supporting there. Joining me today for the webinar is Filtered IT trainer Deb Ashby. She'll be taking you through everything you need to know about pivot tables, helping you to increase proficiency and productivity with this widely used Excel function. Before I pass over to Deb, just a quick bit of housekeeping from me though. Firstly, if you're new to Filtered, we're an online training provider specialising in the use of adaptive technologies to personalise content, accelerating learning and reducing training time. As AAT members, you have access to a selection of filtered courses as part of your various membership packages. To see what courses are available to you, log into the AAT members area and within that the Excel area, I believe. You can follow us on Twitter with #filteredwebinar to get updates, feedback about webinars or to send us any questions you have. Obviously, if there are any more AAT specific webinars arranged, obviously we'll let you know. And if you do have any questions for Deb during the webinar, please submit them via the question pane, which is on the right hand side of your screen right now. If there's demand, we'll have a little break at halfway to answer some of them, and then we'll take some more questions at the end. Depending how many we receive, we may not be able to go through all of the questions. So if yours doesn't get answered, please do email us at info@webinarsteam.com after the webinar if we don't get to yours. And just to let you know, you will have a follow-up email after the webinar with all this information, so don't worry if you haven't caught it. But that's pretty much everything from me, so it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Deb to kick off today's webinar.
Thank you, Alan. Good afternoon, everyone. A very warm welcome from me to this afternoon's webinar on pivot tables. As Alan mentioned, my name is Deborah Ashby. I'm the IT trainer for Filtered, and really it's my job. I'm a Microsoft Office expert, so it's really my job to make sure that all of our Microsoft Office copies are kept up to date, so our Excel, our Word, etc., and also run webinars like this for you lovely people. So I will be hosting the session today on pivot tables, and the way that I like to structure these sessions, we're going to run for about an hour. I'm going to try not to overrun because I do tend to talk a little bit too much, so I'm going to try and keep it to an hour. And we're going to go through a series of live demonstrations. So I've just got a few slides at the beginning just to run through the agenda with you, and then we're going to jump straight into some live examples. Just so you know the kind of level that we're pitching this at, this is basically sort of basic to some of the more intermediate features. So it's really kind of aimed at people who are not that familiar with pivot tables. We're going to go in, we're going to take a look at how you create them from scratch and move up to some of the more useful and advanced features. But hopefully, even if you have been using pivot tables for a while, there will be some things that you can pick up as we go through. I will try and go as slow as possible. I am aware that a lot of people are in general writing notes as I'm going through, but just remember that this is also being recorded as well, so we'll make that available to you. So if you do miss anything or I'm going a bit too quick for you, you will have that recording to re-listen to and fall back on. Okay, let's just take a look at our agenda. This does look like a lot of agenda items, and these are all quite small, so it's not quite as scary as it first looks. We're just going to start out by discussing, what exactly pivot tables are and how they are used, because not necessarily everybody needs to use pivot tables. So we'll just have a very brief discussion about what that's all about. We'll then jump in and we'll take a look at more data, and we'll talk a little bit about how you format that data and get it ready for your pivot table. We'll then go in and we'll create a pivot table from scratch, a very easy process, and then we'll take a look at the main point of a pivot table, pivoting that pivot table, and all we mean by pivoting is moving that data around. I'm going to show you how you can configure a pivot table, some of those options, and also how you can use external data sources. So a lot of the data we're going to be using is in the same spreadsheet as where we're creating the pivot table, but I'll show you how to use data that's stored in spreadsheets that isn't necessarily in the same spreadsheet you're currently working on, if that makes sense. We'll take a look at managing pivot table data. Summarizing data, grouping pivot table fields, and also how you use pivot table data in a formula. We'll look at sorting pivot table data and also filtering a pivot use slicers. Now slicers might be something that you're as familiar with. Slicers are not just related to pivot tables. You can use them in other things in Excel, and they are fairly new. They were introduced in Excel 2013, so if you've been using 2013 or 2016, you will have those slicer options there. Unfortunately, if you're on an older version, that slicer option won't be there. We're then going to take a look at just how you format your pivot tables at the end, so how you make it look a little bit nicer by using table styles, and also how you can apply some conditional formatting, which again might be something that you've used outside of pivot tables. And then very quickly at the end, if we get time, I'll just show you very briefly how to create a pivot chart. But basically, if you can create a pivot table, then you can create a pivot chart. The process is pretty much exactly the same, but I'd just like to throw that in at the end if we have time. So that is today's agenda. And I've been waiting a very long time to be able to use this slide, and I don't know how many of you are Friends fans out there. I for sure am. This is probably one of my favourite episodes of Friends, where Ross and Rachel are trying to get their couch up the stairs and Ross is screaming pivot. So I thought that might just be quite a nice little thing to have up on the screen whilst we just speak very briefly about exactly what a pivot table is. So as I said, not everybody necessarily needs to use pivot tables. So, you know, if you do a job where you just need to do basic calculations, some, you know, formatting, this, that and the other, conditional formatting, you may not have any use for a pivot table, and that's completely fine. But if your job involves things like data analysis or summarizing large data sets, you're really going to find that pivot tables are a little bit of a godsend, and understanding how they work is really important. This is probably one of the biggest misconceptions with pivot tables. People tend to think they're very complicated, and actually that they're very, very simple. So that's kind of my aim today, is to demystify pivot tables and explain them to you in a way that's very, very simple to understand, and you can hopefully go away and then build on the examples that I've shown you. So enough of my talking and enough of these slides. Let's get into taking a look at our first live example. Now I am going to be switching around in between a few different spreadsheets, and the first one that we're going to use is this one. Just bear with me. Called introducing. So before we actually go in and start creating a pivot table, I just wanted to show you at the beginning one that was complete, so you can kind of see what we're aiming for. And again, I know we've probably got people with a lot of different abilities with regards to pivot tables on the call today, so I am starting very basic. So this is a very basic pivot table, and what we mean by a pivot table, it's just a table of data. It's a dynamic table of data, so we can move things around to really extract that data that we want from that information. So that's all a pivot table is, and that hence why it gets its name pivot. You can move fields around and pull out the information that you want and rearrange that data to make it more meaningful. So this is a pivot table, and you can see here on the right-hand side of the screen we have this little menu system, or task pane I should say, which says pivot table fields, and you can see here it's got department, quarter and sales, and these are basically the column headings. So if I click on, I'm on sheet 4 at the moment, if I just click across to sheet 1, you'll see here this is where we have the data that's being used in the pivot table. So you can see the table headings are department, quarter and sales. So when I create my pivot table, it picks up the 3 headings just there. If you had a table with 100 headings, it would pick up all 100 and it will pull them in. I can then choose what data I want to show by dragging and dropping these headings into these various different areas at the bottom here. So you can see we have 4 different areas: filters, columns, values and rows. And if you just take a look at what we have in these boxes at the moment, so all of them are ticked currently, so department, quarter and sales, which means they are in use in that pivot table. And I can see that I have quarter listed in columns, and if we take a look at our pivot table, I can see that I have the different quarters listed in my columns, so 1, 2, 3 and 4. In the rows we have department, which is correct, so we have balance, dance, play, sport and work in my rows, and then our actual data, so the sum of all of our sales data is located in the values field, and that is in the middle here, so that's the main bulk of your data, and I currently don't have anything in that filters area. So that is basically what a pivot table looks like when you first do it. And what I could do is I could pivot this pivot table. So I could take, for example, where it says quarter in columns, I could grab that field and I could drag it across and drop it into rows to get my data to display in a slightly different way. So now you can see that I have this data sorted by, in the rows column I've got department, and I also have the quarters as well. So you can see that very simply. So you can drag them around. That's the thing you'll find with pivot tables. That's sometimes the hardest part of a pivot table, is really deciding what it is that you're trying to get out, what information you're trying to extract, and then arranging those fields in order to pull that data out. So sometimes it is a little bit of trial and error, moving things around and seeing how that pivot table looks. So in its most basic form, that is kind of the end result of a pivot table. So what we're going to do now that you've seen that, and I just wanted to show you that so you could see what we're aiming for, we're going to go in, we're going to take a look at some raw data, and then we're going to create a pivot table from scratch, and you'll see how very, very easy it actually is. So I'm just going to close down this spreadsheet and move across to the format to spreadsheet. Okay, so we're talking a little bit about the raw data that we're using now, and this is really important. So when you are about to create a pivot table, it's really important that you take a look at the data that you're going to be using in that pivot table. There are a few things that you need to watch out for. So for example, in your data, you shouldn't have any blank rows, blank columns, anything along those lines. So if you see your data and it's got, and I'll just very briefly put like something like that in there, that's not going to work. If I was to create a pivot table with my data like this, if I was clicked down here, the pivot table is only going to include all of this data from there downwards. If I was clicked up here, it's only going to include this little bit up here. So the row, an empty row in there will kind of break up your data. So make sure that you go through and you remove any empty rows, any empty cells, anything along those lines from your data. It's also important to make sure that your data is consistent as well. So for example, in this sales column, I can see there that I have all numerical values in there. You don't want to have a mixture of things in there, so I wouldn't, and it doesn't really make sense to have it in there, but you never know, you may come across some data which might have a mixture of text and numbers in there. So the data should be consistent, having the same kind of numbers or text in the columns or in the rows. So it's always worth going through and checking your data. It's also worth watching out for extraneous data around your table. So again, if I had some numbers typed into here, it would be careful not to kind of include things. If I didn't want that included in my pivot table, either make sure that I move it out of the way, I delete it, or I make sure that when I select my range for my pivot table that I'm not including that extraneous data. So just a few little tips and things to watch out for. Now, before I create my pivot table, the first thing in general that I do, and I would also recommend, and is recommended by Microsoft to do this, is to put your raw data into a table or format your data as a table. You'll see on the Home ribbon, which I'm currently clicked on, if you cast your eye across to the Styles group, you have an option here for Format as Table. And again, if you're a good user of Excel, you've probably used this option before. It is a little bit misleading with Excel. It kind of does look like my current data is in a table, but it isn't. It's just because Excel is kind of set out in a grid format. It kind of looks like it's in a table, but it's actually not. So the first thing I will always do, and I will format my data as a table. So you can click anywhere in your data, go to Format as Table, and just select any one of these options. It really doesn't matter what it looks like. And you'll see here that Excel will pick up the data that I'm currently clicked in. Okay, so make sure that you haven't picked up any extraneous data around the outside and that you have those what we call marching ants around your data range that you want to include in the pivot table. And also very important, just make sure that you've got my table has headers selected and click on OK. Okay, so your data is now in a table, and the reason why we generally tend to do that is that it can be helpful because you can do things like name your table, so you can give your table a name up here, which can be useful if you want to reference it later on. It also makes it a lot easier to add data to your pivot table. So in a moment we're going to create a pivot table based on this data, but say I wanted to add in some more data to include in the pivot table, I can just click on the last part of the table down here, the last cell in this table, And if I press the Tab key, it's going to take me to the next row within that table, and I could add in some more data if I wanted to. And then when I refresh the pivot table, it's going to include that data in there. So it just makes your life a little bit simpler, a little bit easier. And I'm just going to Control Z to come out of that. Okay, so always recommend format that data as a table. We had this question last time. Do I have to format it as a table? You do not have to format it as a table. You could select the range before you do the pivot table. If you want to, that's absolutely fine. I always find it works best, and it's a good thing to get into the habit of doing. It takes 2 seconds, create a table, and you'll find that as you move through pivot tables, you'll find that it does help you if it's already formatted as a table. So it's just a recommended step before you start to create your tables. Okay, let's go in now and let's create a pivot table based on our data just here. So this is very, very simple. Click in your raw data and then go to the Insert ribbon. And you'll see in that first group, or the first icon in fact, on that Insert ribbon is Pivot Tables. So we're going to select Pivot Table icon. So the first thing it's asking us to do is select a table or select a range. Okay, so if I had named my table, I could type in the name of my table in here. I haven't named it, so it's just got the default table 1, and you can see the marching ants around the outside. So it has actually picked up the data where I'm currently clicked, so that's absolutely fine. And then moving down, it's saying, where would you like me to create this pivot table? So on a new worksheet or on the existing worksheet? Now, I always like to create them on a completely new worksheet. I like to keep my raw data separate from my pivot table. I just find it a little bit tidier and easier to work with, but by all means, if you want to keep it on the same page, go ahead. So I'm going to select New Worksheet, and I'm going to click on OK. And this is what you'll be presented with. So you've got here your pivot table builder, and then on the right hand side we have those pivot table fields again. So at the moment our pivot table is empty, and I can see that it's picked up our headings, so department, quarter and sales. It's not showing anything currently in the pivot table because I don't have anything selected, so I now need to go in and start arranging those fields by dragging and dropping them to the various different areas below to get my pivot table to build. So again, it depends how you want or what data you're trying to get out of your pivot table. So I'm just going to get hold of departments and I'm going to drag it down to columns, and you'll see as I drop it starts to build. So we've got our departments now listed in the columns. I'm going to take quarter and I'm going to drag that down to rows, and you'll see now we have 1, 2, 3, 4 representing our 4 quarters. And then we're going to take our sales data, so that's the actual data, and we're going to put that across in values just there. And simple as that, you have created a pivot table. Now, I know that we're using very, very simple data. We've got 3 columns, a little bit of data. You're probably going to be dealing with spreadsheets that are a lot more complex than the one which we're using in the example today. But it doesn't matter whether you have 3 rows or if you have 500 rows. The concept is the same. You're just going to have a lot more fields in there and a lot more different ways that you can pivot that data and display your data and extract it. Okay, so hopefully that kind of explains the basic concept of creating a pivot table. One field that we haven't really spent much time on is this filters field. So you can drag things into filter, and that kind of gives you like a little filter area at the top. So I could drag department across to filters if I wanted to, and you'll see now I can select, and then it gives me my departments listed as kind of like a filter. So I can click on dance and click OK, and then it's just showing me the sales figures for the dance department for quarters 1, 2, 3 and 4. So the filter field is slightly different. And you'll see as you click outside of your pivot table, that pane on the right hand side disappears. So just make sure that you are clicked in order to see that pane come back again. Okay, so as I said, you can really kind of arrange these how you want to arrange them. Lovely. Okay, let's close that down. And we're going to talk a little bit about another new feature, and I think this was introduced in 2013 as well. It's a new feature called Recommended Pivot Tables, and again this has been put into Excel to help you. So again, we've got this same data that we're using, our raw data. It's not currently in a pivot table, and I want to create a pivot table from this data. Now I'm going to go to the Insert ribbon, but this time instead of clicking on Pivot Table, if you look next to it, I have a Recommended Pivot Tables button. And if you hover over it, you get that tool tip. You know, with all things in Microsoft, if you hover over the icon, it's going to give you that tool tip explaining what that does. So it says here, want us to recommend a pivot table that summarizes your complex data? Click this button to get a customized set of pivot tables that we think will best suit your data. So, you know, if you're not sure how you want your data to display, Recommended Pivot Tables will give you some suggestions. So it will look at your data and it will say, oh, you could display it like this or like this or like this, and you can scroll through and you can have a look and see if it looks like the kind of pivot table that you might want to create. Now, some of these, like this one here, count of sales, I'm not really interested in that. What have we got here? Sum of quarters, no, not really interested in that. But what about this one? Sum of sales and sum of quarter by department. That looks interesting. So you can then select it and click on OK, and it will build that pivot table for you. I'm just going to make that a bit bigger because it is quite small. Okay, so again, it will open up your pane. If it's not quite right, you can then just tweak it however you want to tweak it. So Recommended Pivot Tables is there to help you and suggest pivot tables that might best suit the data that you have selected. Lovely. All right, let's close down now. I told you there was a lot of switching around between spreadsheets. One day I'll put all these on one spreadsheet so there's not so much opening and closing. Okay. Now let's take a look at pivoting a pivot table. So obviously that is the whole point of a pivot table. That is the difference between a static table and a pivot table. So your static regular table is just static data. It doesn't move. It is what it is, and you read down your columns and read across your rows, and that's about as much as you can do with a table. Whereas a pivot table, we can move them around, pivot things around. That data is very dynamic. So we've seen a little bit about how you pivot or move around the fields. It's very, very simple. So again, let's just have a look at some of the things that we can do. So we can drag quarter down to our rows column. You can also reorder them. So I've got year and quarter underneath rows. I could drag quarter above year just to get something completely different. So you can do lots of different things in here. Now, some people also think that you can't have two lots of values in the values area. You can. I mean, sometimes it doesn't particularly make sense, but you could put two things in the values area to get a different thing as well, so, or different result I should say. So really pivoting those pivot tables around is a little bit of trial and error. And as I said, currently we don't have regions selected, but I could select that and drag it to the filters area if I wanted to, and use that to filter out by whichever region I want. Okay, so really very, very nice and simple. Now, there are lots of tools when it comes to pivot tables to kind of manage or configure your pivot tables. So, for example, I'm clicked in this pivot table here, and if you cast your eyes to the top of the screen, we've got our ribbons running across the top, and you'll see, as with everything in all of the Microsoft applications, we have something called a contextual ribbon, and this might not be something that you're familiar with, this term particularly. You'll see we have a ribbon that says Pivot Table Tools, and we have two sub-ribbons of that, Analyze and Design, and all of the commands on here are related to that pivot table. And it's called a contextual ribbon because if I was to click outside of that pivot table, that entire ribbon structure disappears, so I no longer have access to my pivot table tools. Okay, it would be the same if you were working in a Word document and you'd inserted a picture. If you were to click on the picture, you get the contextual ribbon for picture tools. When you click off, it disappears. It's really just Microsoft's way of saving space and only showing you ribbons and commands when they're actually relevant to you. Okay, so I'm going to click back in my pivot table, and we can see our pivot table tools and the two sub-ribbons, Analyze and Design. And we're going to stick on the Analyze ribbon for the moment, and you can see there's lots of different things that we can do on here, and we are going to dip into some of these options. But I'd like you just to cast your eyes across to the last group at the end, the Show group, and you can see we have Field List, plus minus buttons, and also field headers. I just very briefly wanted to show you this. These are all currently selected, meaning that they're all turned on in our pivot table. So you can see here the plus and minus buttons. Now if you look at our data currently, the way I've got it displaying, I have 2012 and 2013 which both have little pluses and minuses, so I can kind of minus them or expand them, I should say collapse them and expand them depending on what I want to see. And again, we don't have too much data. If you had a lot of data, this can sometimes be quite useful just to minimize the things which aren't particularly relevant. But if you don't particularly want those plus and minuses, and those will get put on automatically sometimes by Excel depending on where you've dragged your pivot table fields, if you don't want those listed on there, you can just get rid of those by clicking in that show group and on that show button to get rid of them. And you can just very easily toggle them back on again. The same thing with this pivot table fields pane. You can turn that off and on just by clicking on the field list button, and that will get rid of or bring back that pivot table fields button. So I used to get a lot of calls when I worked on the help desk, people constantly losing their pivot table fields pane and wanted to know how to get it back. There's two ways. You can click on that, or you can just make sure that you're clicked in your pivot table data. And the last one, field headings, just relates to the headings that we have up here, so maybe you want to kind of get rid of those, not particularly all that useful, but just wanted to show you those just so you have an understanding of where those are and how to get your pivot table pane back if you happen to lose it. All right, now let's take a look at how we've gone through and we've created a pivot table based on data that we have in the same spreadsheet. Let's go through and take a look at how we connect to external data. So you might have a spreadsheet that you've got saved locally or on a network drive, or maybe you've had a client or somebody email you a spreadsheet and you want to create a pivot table from that external data. So by external data we just mean something that's not within the workbook that you're currently using. So let's take a look at how we connect to external data sources and pull those in. Again, this is very, very simple to do. So for this we're going to use the Connect spreadsheet. And currently we have no data on here, so I'm not working with data that's in this spreadsheet. I'm going to pull it in from a different spreadsheet. So we go through the same process of creating a pivot table as we did before. So I'm going to go to the Insert ribbon and I'm going to click on Pivot Table. Now if you remember last time here, we had a table that we selected. Our data was here, we selected the range, and then we went through this little wizard. But this time we don't have any data. We want to use an external data source. So as you can see, this isn't rocket science. I'm sure you can see where we need to go. Use an external data source. I then can select it by clicking on Choose Connection. And I'm going to click on the bottom button here, Browse for More, which will take me to my local drives. I can then go in and I can select wherever I've got my data source saved. Now, it's not necessary. I'm going to use another Excel spreadsheet, but your data might be stored in something different. So it might be a database file, an Access file, something along those lines. Pivot tables kind of work with anything that's kind of in a list format. I think you can even create them, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm sure that, I haven't done this for a long time, I'm sure you can create them also from Word documents. If you have a table in Word, I'm pretty sure you can create pivot tables from Word documents as well. So it doesn't necessarily always have to be in an Excel spreadsheet. So I'm going to go in very quickly and select from my desktop the file that we're going to use, and I just have one called external data, so I'm going to click on OK. Once you select your spreadsheet or whatever it is, Excel will look at that spreadsheet and you'll see here that it's found one sheet of data. So on that spreadsheet, however many sheets you have with data on it, you'll be presented with all of those sheets there. So if I had data on 3 sheets in my workbook, it would show me all 3 sheets there, and I would need to tell Excel which sheet my data that I want to use is located on. So I only have 1 sheet, so that's fine. And I'm going to click on OK, and then I'm going to click on OK. And once again, it's looked at that data, it's brought me to my pivot table builder, and you can see here I've got my pivot table fields. This time I've got day, department, month, and sales, and I can go through and I can drag and drop those. So let's drag and drop department to columns, and you can see my pivot table is kind of building in the middle of my workbook, and that's because I was clicked in cell D8 when I went in to pull that data through. So if you want it up in the corner, make sure that you are clicked in cell A1. You can always move it, it's no big deal, but if you're wondering why suddenly it's kind of in the middle there, that's why, that's where I was clicked. Okay, so we've moved department columns, and we're going to move month into the rows, and you'll see this as we build, and we're going to move our sales into values just like that. Okay, and again I could use drag day somewhere else if I wanted to, or I could use it as the filter depending on what I want to do. So hopefully that's making it a little bit clearer. We're kind of at the halfway point now, so I'll just stop just very briefly just to see if we've got any questions come in through chat that anybody wants to discuss. No, currently no, that's fine. So we'll have another little break at the end for questions. I just wanted to make sure that we did stop at the halfway point. Lovely. All right, let's close that down and move on to an exercise called consolidating data from multiple sources. So this is if you want to create a pivot table when you have multiple tables of data. So again, that might be across different workbooks, which is absolutely fine, or it might be that you have maybe different data across 3 different worksheets and you want to kind of pull it all together and use that data to create a pivot table. So this is what we call consolidating data. So let's go in and take a look at how we work with that. So I'm going to open the spreadsheet for consolidating. And you'll see here, so we've got 3, if you look at the bottom, we've got 3 tabs. The first one is called support calls, the second one is called order calls, and the third one is called return calls. So very similar looking data, but the actual information is different. So you can see here on support calls we've got region and years, 2010 to 2013. We have our regions, north, south, east and west, and then we have our data. So support call data for those regions between 2010 and 2013. And you'll see on the next tab we have similar data. The numbers are different, the information is different, but the fields are the same. So it's the same years that we're using, and it's the same regions as well. And that's quite important if you're consolidating data, that the data is consistent across the items that you want to consolidate. So I want to kind of pull this all together into one pivot table. And very simple way of doing this as well. Now, Microsoft, in their wisdom, shall we say, removed the option that you need to do, that you need to use for this from the ribbon. So unless you know the keyboard shortcut, you're not going to be able to get to the pivot table wizard, which is the option that we need. So I'm going to, before I do it, I'm just going to write on the screen so you can take a moment just to write this down, because as I said, if you don't know it, if somebody doesn't tell you, then it's, and I'm going to try and make that a bit bigger. So that's the shortcut, Alt-D-P, and that will bring up the pivot tables wizard. Now you don't press them all at the same time, you don't need to be ambidextrous or anything like that. You just press the Alt key followed by the D key followed by the P key, and that will then open up the pivot table wizard. Don't press them all at the same time. Okay, let's delete that. So I'm going to go in, I'm going to press Alt, I'm going to press D, I'm going to press P, and there we go. Like magic, we have our pivot table and pivot chart wizard pop up. And I am a huge fan of wizards. They're getting less and less in the Microsoft applications, and I think it's a shame because wizards I always find so helpful. They're particularly useful. If you're not kind of really sure what you need to do, the wizard will always help you greatly. So as I said, I am a huge fan of these. And we're going to use the wizard to go in and create our big pivot table, which is going to consolidate our 3 pivot tables that we have on these tabs. So again, this isn't rocket science. I'm sure most of you could work through this wizard without any guidance whatsoever from me. Okay, so it says where is the data that you want to analyze. So it's got Microsoft Excel list, external data source, or multiple consolidation ranges. So for this, it's multiple consolidation ranges. What kind of report do you want to create? So a pivot table or a pivot chart. So we're going to do a pivot table, and I'm going to click on Next. the next thing it's going to ask me, it says you can create a pivot table report that uses ranges from one or more worksheets and that has no page fields. So it says how many page fields do you want? Now don't worry too much about this option. So it's got create a single page field for me, or I will create the page fields. Don't really worry about this too much. I always select I will create the page fields. I don't want it creating fields for me. So always select that second option and then click on next. And then you can go in and start to build up your data ranges. So you can see my cursor is flashing in the cell that says range. So it's saying, where is your first range of data that you want me to include in the pivot table? So I'm going to go in and I'm going to select it. So I'm going to make sure I'm clicked on that first spreadsheet called support calls, and I'm going to select my data like so. And you can see now it's put that data in there, and I need to click on the add button, and it's going to add it to the box below that says all ranges. So this will now allow me to go to the next spreadsheet and select my next range of data. So you can see you're kind of building up that information, and click on add. And you pretty much do the same. I can move to the next one and select my next range of data, and then click on add. So you would go through and just select the data and click add just to add it in, and then you can click on next. And it says where do you want to put the pivot table report, and I'm going to choose let's do new worksheet again and click on finish. And you'll see that it's basically consolidated all of that data together, and I can then go in and I can move that data around between the columns and the rows, so on and so forth. So a very simple way. You could use exactly the same process if you had data in different workbooks. You would just open the workbook, move across to the workbook and select the range. So it would pick up that you're in a different workbook as well. So it doesn't necessarily have to be on different spreadsheet tabs. Okay, so that's quite a nice way. Sorry about that, my virus software is just popping up. We'll just close that down. Lovely. All right, let's close that down. Hopefully that made sense to everybody. And we're not going to save that. All right, let's move across to managing. So again, this is just a way of managing your pivot table. So if you need to do things like move your pivot table around, copy your pivot table, it's very, very simple. So you can just go in and copy and paste as you normally would. So you can see here I have a pivot table. And a little quick tip of mine, if you want to just highlight all of your table, make sure that you are clicked in the table, and if you press Control-A, that will highlight the entire table. So you don't necessarily have to always click and drag over the cells to select a table. You can just click in, do Control-A, and that will highlight any of the data that's around it. So I quite like to use that to select my entire table. You must be clicked in the table though. If you're clicked above the table and you select do Control-A, that's going to highlight your entire spreadsheet. Okay, so make sure that you are clicked in there. And you can then do right-click, copy, cut, whatever it is you want to do, or alternatively you can use your cut or copy options on the home ribbon, or Control-C, Control-V. I'm a keyboard shortcut girl when it comes to editing, so I'm going to do Control-C, and you'll see we get the marching ants around the outside. I can then go in and I can paste that table wherever I want to, and you'll see it brings across all of my pivot table fields as well. Again, very nice and simple. Let's close that down. All right, I'm going to move across to different exercise files now, and we're going to move across to the exercise files for subtotals and grand totals, and I'll find those in the totals worksheet. So some other things that you can have in here. So let's just take a look at the data that we have on the screen. So you can see here I have some data for 2012 and 2013, quarters 1, 2, 3 and 4, and for different regions, so east, north, south and west. And then we have a grand total column, and we have grand totals running across the bottom as well. And you'll see, and it's not that obvious unless you point it out, in here for 2012 we also have subtotals. These subtotals are currently listed just under the region headings. And that's what Excel does by default. It will put subtotals just below your headings. Now for me, that's not a natural way to see subtotals. If I'm looking at data, I would in general expect to see subtotals and totals kind of at the bottom. So, you know, you can move those totals around. And again, that's done through the ribbons at the top here. So make sure you're clicked on your pivot table. Put your mouse up to your pivot table tools contextual ribbon and go to the Analyze ribbon. Sorry, not the Analyze ribbon, the Design ribbon. And you'll see in that first layout group you have options for subtotals and grand totals. This is where you can control whether you have them turned on, whether you have them turned off, and also where they display. So if I want to change where these subtotals are located, I can just click the drop down. I can choose not to show them at all, to remove them, or I can show them at the bottom of the group or at the top of the group. So I'm going to show them at the bottom of the group, which for me, that makes more sense to my eyes. Okay, you could do the same thing with the grand totals if you wanted to. So in grand totals, you have the option to turn it off for rows and columns, turn it on for rows and columns, turn it on for rows only or columns only. So again, it really just depends how you want to see those grand totals. Okay, so I could turn it off completely. One thing I would say to you, and I'm just going to turn these back on, is if you have a formula which contains maybe the grand total. So if I type into just a random cell just here that equals, and maybe I decide I want to use this grand total for some kind of calculation, you'll see that when you do click on a cell that's located within a pivot table, Excel will put in this get pivot table data function, and it will then reference the pivot table. And you can go in and you can do whatever the formula is that you need to do. I'm just going to press enter, which means it's just going to basically display what I have in there because I didn't do any other calculation. However, bear in mind that if you do that and you do have those grand totals or subtotals linked either on this worksheet or on another worksheet, if you then go in and turn off grand totals, if I just show you again, if I go to the design ribbon and turn off grand totals, you're then going to get an error throughout your formulas because it's where it's referencing is now disappeared. Okay, so just bear that in mind if you are using grand totals and subtotals in other formulas across your spreadsheet. It's not going to show if you hide them. Okay, it's an important point worth noting, I think. All right, now staying on this data, I'm just going to delete that out. In fact, let's Control-Z a couple of steps and put our totals back. There we go, lovely. There are some other things that you can do with your data once you've got it in this in the pivot table, and these things I think you'll find quite useful, and they're all available in the right-click menu. So click anywhere in your data. I'm just going to randomly click on cell C7, and if you right-click your mouse, you have some options which you might find quite useful. So the first one I want to show you is the summarize. Just bear with me. Yep, summarize values by. So you can see here we have this option just here. So currently I've got sum selected, but if I wanted to, I could see an average of all of the figures for north, south, east and west, or I could see the count or the min or the max, which I'm sure are all formulas that you're reasonably familiar with. So currently I've got sum selected, so what that means is what I'm seeing in the totals is a sum basically of all of these numbers. What about if I want to see the average? I can right click, summarize values by, and do average, and you'll see that my data in here doesn't change. That's still the same, but my totals change. So now it's given me an average of all of these numbers. So 545 is the average value in the east column. Okay, so you can go in and you can really kind of go to town a little bit on how you summarize your values. These are just the popular ones that you might want to use, but you can click on more options and have access to the full range of functions that you might want to use in there. So that's always quite a nice way of changing your data or manipulating your data within your pivot table as well. You can also do things like show values as. So this is another one. If you wanted to, for example, show the values as a percentage of the grand total, you could do that from here as well. So if we look at our data again, maybe I'm looking to find out how these values are split across 2012 and 2013. So what percentage of sales did we have in 2013 and what percentage of sales did we have in 2012 as in comparison to the grand total? So what I could do again is right click, go to show values as and do percentage of grand total. Okay, so that's kind of then showing me what that percentage is. All right, so lots of different things that you can do within there. Hopefully that makes sense to everybody. And we've got about 15 minutes left, so just a few more items to cover off on our list. And I'm just going to close down that spreadsheet. So we're going to take a look at grouping. So let's switch across to our grouping worksheet. Okay, so we have, again, let's just take a look at the data that we have on the screen. So we have, again, our different departments, balance, dance, play, sport, work. We have our months and we have our, what have we got here? I think those are our weeks that we've got in there as well. So the weeks of January, weeks of February, so on and so forth. Then we have our data. It is all in dollars, I'm afraid. These are practice files from Microsoft, so you have to forgive me. I haven't converted them all to pounds as yet, but hopefully you get the idea. And what we can do is we can add grouping to our pivot tables. So for example, you might want to be able to collapse and expand, or you might only be interested in certain information. So for example, if I was only interested in the information for weeks 3, 4 and 5, I might choose to collapse up weeks 1 and 2, or maybe I was sending this to a client and they were particularly interested in a certain piece of data. I could make it a little bit easier for them to see, and I could group that data and get it out the way. So if I only want to really see 3, 4 and 5, I could highlight rows 1 and 2, and I'm just dragging my mouse over the column numbers just there, and I could go in and group these two things. So grouping is on the data ribbon, and you'll see right at the end we have a group called outline, and we have an option for group. I'm going to click and click group, and you'll see what that then gives me is it opens up this little area or this little margin on the left hand side where I have a little minus. So I could then collapse that up. The data isn't deleted, it's still there. I can get it back by clicking on the plus, but it just means that it's out the way. And you can add as many of these to your spreadsheet as you like. So I could go through and I could choose to collapse up this section as well if I wanted to, and just group it all together and collapse it up like so. So it's quite nice if you've got a lot of data, a very large spreadsheet, and maybe only part of it is relevant to the person that you're sending this spreadsheet to. You don't want to delete the data, but you could collapse it up like that. You know, it's an alternative to hiding. Sometimes it's a little bit easier to see that you've actually got rows hidden if you group them instead. So you can group items in your pivot table as well. Lovely. Always remember, oops, I'll do that again, is you can also drill down into pivot tables and get to that raw data that's being imported into that pivot table. So you can see here currently I'm clicked on cell G5, which is the grand total for January. Now if I wanted to see a closer look or analyze that data a bit more, instead of going back to my raw data, which is located over here, I can just double click and that will drill me into that raw data. So that's just a quick way of getting to your raw data and seeing, and you can click on any of the totals just to kind of see that underlying raw data, which is also quite useful sometimes. Lovely. Also bear in mind, in your pivot tables you do still have access to things like sorting options. So again, if I'm clicked in here and I right click my mouse, I do have option to sort options, so I can sort my numbers smallest to largest, largest to smallest, depending on how I want to display them. If I had text in here, it would sort them alphabetically, A to Z. It really depends the information that you have in here. So remember, in that right-click menu, you still do have access to a lot of the Excel features that you know and love. All right, now let's talk a little bit about sliders. I mentioned at the start of the session, this may or may not be a feature that you've come across as yet, as it was new in 2013, and I really like sliders. I think they're kind of cute, they're kind of fun, but also very, very useful as well. And it's a different way of kind of filtering your data and making it easy for other people to extract data from your spreadsheet. So maybe you have a very large table of data, and you've created a pivot table and it's all lovely, and you want to send that to someone who maybe has zero knowledge in pivot tables and doesn't know how to manipulate that data to get the information out of it that they need. You could add slicers to it, and then it's very obvious to them how they use that in order to filter out that data. So I'm going to show you how slicers work. So we're going to go back to our exercise files, and just bear with me while I find our slicers worksheet. There we go. So again, it's the same old data that we're using across just to keep things consistent. And I'm now going to add in some slicers for my data. And slicers are located on a couple of ribbons. You can find them, I believe, on the data ribbon. Oops. She says, I might possibly be lying to you there. Yes, it appears I'm lying to you. I'm sure you can find them on another ribbon somewhere. Is it insert? Where is it? Yes, sorry. It's on the insert ribbon, so you'll see we've got slicers just there. But if you're clicked in a pivot table, you'll also find it on the pivot table tools contextual ribbon as well, and you'll find insert slicer in there. I knew it was in two places. Forgive me, I often get confused between which ribbon things are on. All right, so we're going to use the slicer on the Analyze ribbon as it is part of the pivot tables group. I'm going to make sure I'm clicked in my pivot table, and I'm going to do Insert Slicer. And I guess these get their name from the fact that you're kind of going in and you're slicing up that data, making it a little bit more readable, a little bit easier to see. So again, what this will do is when you click on Insert Slicer, it's going to show you all of your column headings, so your data headings, so year, quarter, region, and customers. And you can choose which one you want to add. Now you have to add them one at a time, but you can add more than one slicer to your table. So I'm going to add a slicer for year first of all, so I'm going to select year and I'm going to do OK, and it puts this little thing in here. Now you'll see also when you're clicked on the slicer, if you glance your eyes back up to the ribbons, we now have a ribbon called Slicer Tools, and there's only one sub-ribbon for this, and it's called Options, and it just allows you to do a few things with this slicer as well, such as change the color, which we'll go in and do now just to make it stand out a little bit. So you can change it if you've got a particular color scheme going on or company branding. You know, you can kind of change the color of your slicer however you wish, and I'm going to just make that a little bit smaller. So I can add that to my page, and it sort of starts to make your Excel spreadsheet a little bit more like a dashboard. You can build them up, and it means that somebody can go in, and if they don't know how to maybe get the just show the data for 2012, they can go in and they can just click on 2012 just to show that data. So it makes things very simple for them. It's like a filter. It's another name for a filter, and if they want to clear that data, you can just click clear to bring all of that back up. And as I said, you can add more than one slicer. So again, if I'm clicked in here, I'm going to add another one. Let's go in and do Insert Slicer, and I could add it for region as well, and then I might want to make that a different color so that it stands out, and just format it a little bit and drag it underneath there. So I could then go in, and if I wanted to know what all the sales were for 2013 for the North region, it's very simple to just click 2013 North, and then there I have my data. So that's sometimes a little bit easier for people to use. It's also quite a nice visual way of adding filters to your page and making it more like an interactive dashboard, shall we say. So as I said, slicers may or may not be something that you've come across before. And really just to finish off, because we've got about 5 minutes left, time flies when you're having fun with pivot tables, that's for sure. We are going to do some conditional formatting. So we're going to go in and open up our conditional formatting option. And just bear with me while I find it. I have these all over the place. Nope, not in that one. As I said, one day I will put all these together in a nice, there we go. All right. So again, conditional formatting is something which we generally tend to say to people, it makes your data more visual, more engaging, more interesting. So that's one of the biggest problems with Excel, is that sometimes you're presented with these large spreadsheets and it's just like a wall of data. It's not particularly interesting, it's not particularly easy for people to read. So Microsoft's been tending to move towards this whole idea of how to make your Excel spreadsheets, pivot tables more engaging, more interesting by using things like table styles, conditional formatting. And as I said, you may have used conditional formatting outside of pivot tables, but you can also use them within pivot tables. So once you have your pivot table, like we've got here, I could go in and also apply some conditional formatting. So I'm going to go in, I'm going to highlight my data for January, February and March, and on my home ribbon I have a conditional formatting button in the styles group. So I'm going to click the drop down, and you may or may not be familiar with how this works. There's lots of things that you can do in here. So maybe I want to go in and really highlight to people all of the values in here which are over or greater than a certain number. So I could choose to highlight all cells that are greater than, and this is essentially a rule that you're setting up here, all cells that are greater than, what should we do, let's pick something quite high, they're greater than 75,000. Okay, and you can choose to say how you want that highlighted. So currently I've got light red fill with dark red text, but there's other options that you have in here, or you can customize it and click OK. So that will then highlight very quickly everything that's over a certain amount. And again, I'm sure you can see how that might be useful to you in some spreadsheets that you work with. Just going to do Control Z to reset that back and just show you a couple of others. There are lots of different things that you can do in here. So we could do less than, highlight values less than, or between two numbers, or equal to. It really depends kind of what you're trying to pull out of there. We have something called top and bottom rules, where you can just highlight the top 10% of things in your spreadsheet. We have, bottom 10%, above average, below average, so lots of different options that you have. Would encourage you to kind of have a little look through those if you haven't already. And you can make your data more visual by adding things like data bars. So if I go into here and add a data bar, you'll see that that's more of a visual representation of the numbers within each cell just there. And if you wanted to, you could go in and remove the numbers. So, if you've got some data that's maybe sensitive, so the example I normally give would be, maybe you have a list of employees and you have a list of all of their salaries. So maybe you work in HR or payroll and you're giving a presentation to the board, and you might want to show kind of, the level of salaries for each department, but you don't want to show individuals' actual salaries. So you might want to remove the data and just leave those data bars. So you can do that as well. So once you've added your data bars in, if you go back to conditional formatting and go to manage rules, you'll see there you have your data bar rule, and you can edit that rule, and there is an option to show the bar only in there, which when you click OK will remove the actual data and just show the bar. So you can go in and make edits to your rules as well once you've created them. Okay, so I'm just going to go back and add that back in just so that that makes a little bit more sense. Like so. Okay, and if I click, I'm just going to clear all of the rules from selected, from entire sheet is what I wanted. Okay, now there's some other things in there which you might want to use. Again, I'm just going to highlight that little block of data. I've got color scales in there, which is kind of like a heat map. So this will show you with dark red, with green being the highest number, and you can change that around. And you'll see as you hover over it, will show you kind of what color represents the highest value. So in this case, it's going to be red, yellow, and then green. So it will show your data in various different shades of this scale, so it makes it quite easy to pinpoint a number if you want to see what the highest number is or the lowest number, and it just makes it a little bit more visual and a bit nicer really if you're presenting things. And also finally you have icon sets. I don't find these particularly useful, but I'm sure some people do. I'm just going to add some directional icon sets, and if it looks like that, again, if you highlight your entire spreadsheet, so you can do that by doing Control A. Oh, not Control Z like I just did. Oh, sorry. like that. So if we highlight our entire table and double click on one of the dividers, that's going to just widen those columns and show you your icons there. So my main point here is that you can use everyday functions like conditional formatting to jazz up your pivot tables as well, make them a little bit more functional, a little bit more interesting. And also, very finally, because we've got about a minute left, again, just related to the formatting of your pivot table, is again on your pivot tables tools option you have a design ribbon, and this is where you can apply pivot table style. So again, just to make your data a little bit more interesting, you can go in there and select any of these, and you can modify. If I put one of these on like so, you can kind of modify what you're seeing by using these pivot table style options as well. So you can take the column headings off of bold, the row headers, so on and so forth. So just have a little look through those ribbons. There are lots of options that you can use in there. And finally, because I think we do just have time to squeeze it in, I just want to very briefly show you how to create a pivot chart. As I said, if you can create a pivot table, you can pretty much create a pivot chart because the process is exactly the same. So let's just close out of there and go to, I think I want to be in there. No, I don't want to be in there. I think I'm going to go to that one. Okay, so we have our data just here. Now it might be that instead of creating a pivot table, I want to create a chart instead. So you would do exactly the same thing. Make sure you're clicked in your raw data, and I've got mine formatted as a table as we mentioned at the start. I'm going to go to the Insert ribbon, and this time I'm going to click on Pivot Table again, but instead of, sorry, I'm going crazy. Click in your data and then go to the charts area over here and you have pivot chart. For some reason I thought, and I think they must have moved it. It used to be you clicked on pivot table and you had the option for chart, but it's actually over here now in the charts column. So let's click on pivot chart and select pivot chart. So you're going to get the exact same box as when, or dialog box as when you click on pivot table. So it's going to say where is your table or your range of data, and you can see mine's highlighted, and you go through the same options. So I'm going to put it on a new worksheet and I'm going to click on OK. And this time, instead of it gives me a pivot table and a pivot chart essentially, so I can go through and I can build up my values, but you can see here it's slightly different. I have legend, axis, so it depends what I want to be listed where, so I can put my different things wherever I need them to go, like so. And again, you can move those around so that you can have that displayed as you want. So it kind of creates both a pivot chart and a pivot table for you. So very simple to create, and it works in pretty much exactly the same way. All right, that's pretty much all we wanted to go through with you in this session. I know it's kind of pitched at a very basic level, but hopefully for those of you who are a little bit, unsure about pivot tables, or you're a bit concerned that, that they're very complex, hopefully that's shown you that they're actually very simple to use. And as I said, this has been recorded, so if you need to go back and review anything, feel free. So I think we'll just finish up today by seeing if there's any questions.
Hi Deb, yes, we've got a few questions. Thanks for everyone. Thanks to everyone. Sorry for sending them in. We won't. I've got all the questions that we can field. So please don't write in with anything else. First one for us is from Andrew. It's from a bit earlier on in the webinar. Andrew asks, are you able to add alternate filters? For example, I have a list of invoices for a year. Can I add a column filter to group them into months, or would I have to have a month column in my base data?
That's quite a long question. These questions, when they're quite long and complex like that, are always quite difficult to figure out if I can't actually see your data. I might have to, do you mind if I take that one offline? If you can just email that to me, Alan, and then I can have a look at it, because it's very difficult to kind of get my head around it when we're in the middle of the webinar. So if you send that to me afterwards, then I'll respond via email and we'll get that answer back to you, Andrew. I hope that's okay.
Not a problem, Deb. Okay, our next question is from Mohammed. This is quite an easy one, I think. Mohammed saw in one of your first exercise books that you've managed to replace the column titles, so A, B, C, for example, with actual titles, so for example, sales or columns. Is that something that's possible? And do you know?
Let me have a look. If I'm understanding what you mean, if I go back to one of my earlier, I think this is the first one we had up. I'm guessing that you mean up here, A, B, C, D. I don't recall having any titles up there. You can't add anything into the ABC. That's set because obviously because of the cell referencing. So it might be that I just had my data in row 1 and you mistook it for being in the headings at the top there. You can't add or you can't change A, B, C, D, E. You can't change those column headings.
Okay, not a problem. Thanks, Deb. Next question is from Kerry. She says, when creating from multiple tables, had you formatted the data as a table? Could you select the data as you did on the first pivot table? Again, it might be quite complex to answer because it was from one of the first ones.
No, I think I know what you mean there. So let's go back to, I think it was the consolidating worksheet. So I had 3 tables here. Now, I think the question you were saying is when I was doing this, or when we were going through, I was selecting the table here. And I think your question is if you'd named this range of data, so if you'd named the table, you could absolutely do it that way as well. So if you named these in advance. So say I'd selected this table and called it support by just typing a name up here. That's absolutely fine. When you go through and then you do the consolidation, instead of selecting the range, you could just select the name of the table. I think if you press the F3 key on your keyboard, that will pop up all of the named ranges that you have. So if you have named your data, you can just select it from there and go through and use it. And all the named ranges, it's just a range of data. So, you know, either way it's doing the same thing. So yes, you can name them and select them that way when you're consolidating. I think that answered your question. If it didn't, let me know, Kerry, and I'll come back to you at the end.
Okay, and last question is from Alison, and she asks, can you show min, max and average all in the same pivot table from the same data, i.e. sales by min, max and average for January?
Let's have a look. So you want all in the same data, sales for, I think you possibly can with that. I'm just trying to think of what worksheet would be the one that we could show that on. Let's think. Let's go to So, for example, if you wanted to show min, max and average in this table underneath here, was that what you're saying, I'm guessing? I'm not sure. I might have to take that one offline as well. So if you can send me that question, if we can make a note of that, because I just want to clarify what it is that you're talking about.
Okay, well, Deb, that's all our questions. So thank you very much for joining us for today's webinar. It was absolutely excellent as per usual. For everyone else, thank you also for joining us. That's everything we've got time for today. If you do have any more questions, as I said earlier, please do email us in at info@webinarsteam, and also I'll be getting back to Andrew and Alison with the answers to your questions as well, so apologies we couldn't get them online, guys. Before I do go, just wanted to say also that for everyone who's asked as well, the recording will be available by round about tomorrow lunchtime via the AAT members area and also on the Filtered YouTube channel, which is Filtered Courses once you're on YouTube. So do check that out if you want to have the recording there. If you also want to check out any other recordings that we've done on Filtered, you can do so at learn.filtered.com/webinars. But that's pretty much everything from us. So all it leaves me to say is if you'd like to join us for our next webinar, that's on the 20th of July. It's not got a confirmed title yet, but it will be on workforce productivity, and we'll be joined by the chairman of the LPI in Learning Technologies, Don Taylor, for that. So that'll be a big name to join us there. But that's everything from us. So all it leaves us to say is obviously thank you so much for joining us. Have a great evening and hopefully catch you for another webinar soon. Take care. Bye.